Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. Just a couple things to note before we get into today's show. If Real Talk has impacted you, we would love if you would take a minute and leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. This is a huge help for us in promoting Real Talk to those who have never listened. And, as always, today's episode is brought to you by our official sponsor, Trivan, builders of custom trucks, trailers, and enclosure buildings tailored to your needs. Be sure to check them out at www.trivan.com. A huge thanks to them for making this conversation possible. Now on to today's episode.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in again. Today I had the pleasure of speaking with Rick Postma, who is the Director of Public Relations at Word and Deed. And specifically we talked today about poverty and some of the work that Word and Deed is doing in impoverished parts of the world and how they go about doing their work, which I find is very unique in its methodology, and I think it's something we could all learn for our local context and also for our foreign aid context. And I just wanted to start with stealing a bit, or paraphrasing an intro, stealing it a bit from a video created by When Helping Hurts. The guys, they also wrote a book on this, but this is from a presentation, and he introduces this presentation and this idea of When Helping Hurts using this, and I'll just paraphrase what he says. Most North Americans define poverty in material terms. So a lack of income or a lack of health care and a lack of housing, basically a lack of food, basically a lack of wealth. And so we define it as material problem. Now, he starts the introduction by asking what poverty is, and that's where Rick and I start this conversation as well. But defining poverty is a very important part of this puzzle, I find, and something that Word and Deed does really well. Now, he makes in this introduction in this When Helping Hurts video presentation, he makes the analogy to a doctor. So when you go to a doctor with a problem, the doctor's diagnosis of your problem is one of the biggest keys to whether or not that doctor is going to be able to help you. Now, if you go to the doctor with a headache and he just hands you a couple Tylenol, what he's doing is treating a symptom and not necessarily understanding the underlying problem behind your headaches. And similarly, when we diagnose poverty, we need to diagnose it correctly in order to know how to help in the situation. And so treating symptoms like a lack of material resources, a lack of healthcare, a lack of food, by providing the things that are lacking is not necessarily the answer. And so this is where Rick and I start. We also get into why a Christian worldview is really the only way to help people who are in poverty. We talk a little bit about government programs from the West, but also the government situations that keep impoverished people in this state. And we also talk about Word and Deed directly, how they affect change in these poor countries, these developing countries. Talk a bit about some of the partnerships, and Rick shares several amazing stories that you won't want to miss. So without further ado, here's Rick Postma from Word and Deed.
So I attended McMaster University and got an engineering and management degree. That's a 5-year degree. Very hard to date girlfriends when you're taking that course. So not recommended if you're in the middle of dating, as my wife will tell you. So she stuck around, so that's good. I can only see her on Sunday. That was it. The rest of the time was really busy because you got an extra course load. But anyway, with that, graduated from that, went on to CP Rail, working as a computer engineer of sorts for 9 years. And then moved on to IBM for 9 years. Also computer engineering, a lot of proposals for big banks, lots of things. It was very interesting, challenging work. At a certain point, IBM started presenting a program where you could take a year leave of absence, and they would keep paying your benefits, and then you come back after a year. So people did all kinds of things with that. So I decided, because Word and Deed was starting to advertise for a third person in the on the Canadian side. There was already one person on the U.S. side, two in Canada. It's a relatively small organization. So it gave us a chance to try it out. Could we come in, raise the donations to be able to support, the number of people and not have too much overhead? So that was the test case. And that provided a nice, it's not working, so let's go back. So the first year went pretty good. And I thought, well, I'll ask them for another year. The worst thing they can say is no. So I asked another year and I described what I was doing. They were pretty enthused about what we're doing.
Oh,
And they
that's
said,
cool.
yes, but after 2 years, you need to make a decision. Second year, we really started to catch momentum. I was really focusing on the donor base, raising funds, raising interest and commitment. And then after 2 years, because it was going so well, I said, no, that's it. I'm really thankful for IBM's support over that time. So that all started in 2005. So hitting my 20th anniversary this year, and it's been a real privilege. We've added a number of people to our team over the years, very much representing our support base. So, we have two Canadian Reform members, we have URC team members, we have OPC and Free Reform team members, and those are all reflected on our boards as well, US and Canada. So
Cool.
it's all about working together
Hmm.
across like-minded denominations.
So what got you interested in doing that work when you were a computer engineer?
Probably about 8, 9 years before I joined Word and Deed, I got involved with Free Reform missions. So I was already traveling to Guatemala as of 2001 or so every year. I was
Oh, cool.
quite involved in our missions work. So that really I was interested to begin with just from reading. I felt a tug. I even wrestled a little bit with, do you go into the mission field or not? But then this door opened. So involvement in Free Reform missions, and then people, when the Word and Deed advertisement came out, people started to tap me on the shoulder and say, "Hey, have you thought about that? Like just from talking to you, that kind of sounds like." And I said, "Yeah, it does." So a lot of prayer, and your income goes down a fair bit. That's only realistic joining a charity. So you had to figure out how to make it work, right? And yeah, you step forward in faith, and the Lord has blessed that. And like I said, along the way, we've just met wonderful people. We have wonderful boards, very, very talented, very committed. And we have the privilege of working together and impacting thousands of lives around the world.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, so we'll get into more, I guess, of the mission and what Word and Deed does, and I guess I'm sure people will collect what the mission and vision of Word and Deed
Yeah.
is as we talk. But today we wanted to dive into poverty, global poverty, and then learning about how in the first world, in developed world, we help people who aren't as materially well off. And I guess using, Word and Deed as a lens for that, considering they have a very unique way of, or a very well thought out way of looking at that issue. So, and we'll probably see that contrast to maybe some of the government assistance programs.
Mhm.
So why don't you start us off with like, what is poverty? Like we would think normally we think about this as material lacking, like lacking in wealth. Um, but obviously it's more than that. It's deeper than that. And I think that we feel it, but we don't exactly know how to describe that. Like how do you put that into words at Word and Deed?
That's a very important question, Tyler. So usually when I make presentations about poverty in Christian schools, high schools, fair number of them each year, and I start with by giving two examples. And just picture this. So in the one example, we have an orphan boy at our program in Malawi. He's sitting on the ground. He's clearly got a skin condition, and he's eating rice and egg, a vegetable, and a nutritious supplement. That's a king's meal for him. And we could sort of gather from that much information. Yeah, here's a young lad who's lost his parents, and he needs some help. He needs food. He needs shelter. He needs to be looked after. Okay, so let's freeze that picture for a minute. Now another picture. So I visited a woman in Colombia, living on a dump. In the dump, it was there are little roads in there, and there's a lot of huts on there, so it wasn't. It was a little community, but a community living in squalor. And when it rains, the sewage runs through her little hut, and she's carrying one child in her arm, and another one's sitting on the ground. And you can picture they're playing in the filth. And you could say your initial assessment now that would say we need to get her out of here, get her into a better place, help her provide for her family. The other piece of information is that she doesn't have a man to support her and look after her. So, so when we initially think of that, we would say, yeah, that initial assessment is really based on a worldview. If we're honest with ourselves, often we fall into that way of thinking, but it's a worldview perspective that just says, okay, both these scenarios, they're lacking things, and that's true. They're lacking food, shelter, water, etc. But um, if we consider a worldview that's secular and effectively treats us as being cosmic accidents, we might come up with the same conclusion, right? Whereas we've been trained and ought to train and not to think in a Christian worldview perspective. So just a quick reminder for you and your guests would be that we've been created to have a relationship with God, with ourself, with our neighbor, and with creation. That's how it started, relationship oriented. Now, sin affects, so picture an X for all of those, X, X, X. Sin affects all of those, and the wages of sin is death. But thanks be to God, he doesn't leave us there as he did the angels who fell. He sends his son to reconcile us, first and foremost, to himself. That's the priority, even though it doesn't always happen first, obviously. But to reconcile us with ourselves, with him, with our neighbor, with creation. So if we take that approach, we start to think from a biblical perspective. And then various key ideas come to the fore when you start thinking biblically: conviction, repentance, forgiveness, reconciliation, as already mentioned, image bearers. Wow, that's a rich term. The fact that we're stewards. We're not owners of the earth, we're stewards of the earth. We report to someone on how we handle the earth. The idea that works of blessing is not a curse is a key concept that we run up against again and again wherever we're working. Most cultures view work as a curse, and I've been told that over and over, as have my colleagues. The idea of covenant, family, servant leadership, all those ideas, and perhaps a real key one is humility. Okay, so default reaction, guilty. When I first joined Word and Deed, go visit these countries and say, you don't even need to talk. I'll just tell you what you need. I could just look around and tell you what your problem is, and I'll wrong,
Right.
wrong,
Yeah.
wrong, wrong. Pride, and that's real easy to do, Tyler. I still find myself falling into that from time to time. So keep reminding ourselves. So here's a key statement, and this is from a book, When Helping Hurts, which I really recommend to everyone. It's probably a good introductory book to understanding and responding to poverty, and the fact that the Lord calls us as his people to joyfully work in serving him by meeting the needs of those who are impoverished. But biblical definition, material poverty alleviation, is working to reconcile those four relationships I just reviewed so that people can fulfill their callings of glorifying God by working and supporting themselves and their families with the fruit of that work. So we're working to restore a picture of creation, of mankind, in a way that reflects God's design. So that's obviously never perfectly. It's an ongoing struggle, but we're called to, as we've been blessed with that teaching, also now to teach others about that. So now when we return to those two stories with that extra thinking, now we revisit the orphan, we ask some more questions, and we find out, well, actually, he's an orphan because his dad sinned with sexual promiscuity. So, had affairs with other women, contracted AIDS, and ultimately died. But he passed it on to his wife, who also died. Unfortunately, that's a very common picture in Africa. Let's say, if obviously sexual promiscuity is worldwide, but the source of that of getting sick and dying. So, sadly, there's another cultural complication, and that is in a lot of African cultures, when the woman dies, the man is considered justified in abandoning his children. And that's
Wow.
very hard for us to understand. But
Hmm.
clearly, see, there's a problem there. There's a way of thinking, obviously sin that we need to deal with from a Christian perspective. So the gospel now has to become central. And there's different ways of combating. We've worked with young people in that culture, run all kinds of training sessions through the local churches there to get them to think biblically, to not default to the heathen culture around them. Same challenge for us. To think biblically, to recognize that sinning sexually is against God, and it often God will punish you in this life in various ways, one of them being death. So that's a deeper view, and now we have a more full-fledged response to that particular picture. Now we go back to the woman living on the dump, and we ask more questions too, and we find out, well, her initial husband, abandoned her, and that's, God gives women a real natural desire to nurture and to look after their children. Men are more selfish. I think you and I can agree to that by nature. Hopefully that's not news to you. And there's a macho culture for men in Latin America. And you can see it when families run down the streets, because you'll observe, and someone pointed this out to me, you'll observe that the little girls are carrying stuff and the little guys are skipping and throwing stones and pushing tires down the road. So they're not given responsibility. It's a cultural thing. It's a blind spot. We have to be careful with that too.
Hmm.
And the men grow up irresponsible. and often at the first sign, or at least after a few hits, few challenges in their family life, they abandon ship. So mom's now left looking after these kids in what really is a very dangerous area. She has no choice but to grab the next guy that comes along. So she's already, we understand after some discussion, very typical, she's gone through 4 or 5 guys by this time who each in turn have abandoned her. But she is, you put yourself in her shoes, you understand, hey, she's very unsafe without a man to guide and guard her, as are her children. So now we have a much better defined problem, and now we move in and help in a much more full-fledged way. So
Wow, yeah.
that's yeah, that's a bit of a long answer to a short question.
Yeah, but no, I mean, that gives a really clear picture of some of these situations. Now, I mean, obviously it raises 100 questions, but
Yeah,
just to go back for a listener, back to the book When Helping Hurts and the relationship. So you described the relationship with God, with self and others and creation. So we understand that in those scenarios you laid out, those are broken relationships, like
yeah.
broken relationships between husbands and wives, and um, broken relationship with God. Obviously, they don't know, even the culture, like you said, doesn't have the same values, and it's really hard to picture that as a Western. Um, we I guess even the secular people in our culture take um, the morality that our culture's built off of for granted, which is a Christian worldview. Um,
We have a Christian heritage, Tyler, so we are blessed with a lot of thinking that still reflects Christianity. There's a great book called The Air We Breathe that I read last year, and it really talks about there's increasing recognition of that, and we have a lot of intellectuals starting to recognize that, like Jordan Peterson and
mhm.
Lyle, Liam Ferguson and others, historians that say there's something about Christianity that we can't afford to lose, even though they come from a bit of a secular perspective. There's lots of hope. But
Well,
yeah, we still benefit from that. We're losing it, and perhaps some other cultures of the world where Christianity is growing, they're gaining it, but they're often in the early stages where we've had 400 years of arguably consistent Christian teaching and foundations, with a lot of our leaders actually exhibiting that.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
Now, there's lots of contrary stories too, but still a pretty strong presence of Christian thinking throughout our Western cultures, which we've lost for the most part, right? And we're wrestling with quite the opposite today, we could say.
Right, right. Yeah, we'll get into like where Western culture's going because I want to talk about that with you too. But back to those relationships, I'm curious how, I guess it's the relationship with self. Now, I'm familiar with the When Helping Hurts. I haven't actually read the book, but they did a whole series of videos on it and all sorts of stuff. Um, the relationship with self is a thing that I found myself not understanding. Like, I understand some cultures don't value Christian values. You understand that, like, yeah, there's broken relationships. So even if you looked at in our cities, you would find plenty of those
Yeah,
where that's really causing material poverty as well as relational poverty. Like, and then even creation, like you see. I mean, obviously the Western world's aimed at net zero and and this climate change agenda. But in developing countries, they don't care. They're burning wood everywhere, and like there's a very clear disparity there that we seem to be. I mean, ahead is not even really a really good way to put it because I think we might be going backwards. Um, but the relationship with self, how does like someone in that situation in the developing world's like self image relationship, how does that play into this? And then I guess tied into that is why is it just not good enough to just give them money? Like that woman in that situation is hurting. So if you give her money, what happens with it? Like, can she not find her way out using money? Like, I feel like that's the typical like Western, like I'll give you things I have because I have too much and you don't have enough, clearly. So,
yeah. So two parts to your question. So number one, the view of the self. We need to help people really take on God's view of humanity. So who is the human, right? Calvin's Institutes, initially starts who is God, who is man, and how have we been designed, and how should we be operating properly, like a train running on a track. So if we don't run on the track properly, or we're going around corners too fast, we're going to hop the track and crash. And God's demonstrated how we are to live. We're made in his image. We're called to obey his commandments in order to flourish. And yeah, we need to view ourselves properly as fallen creatures, but with a God who's merciful. And yeah, we can reach out to him. We can ask him to help us. So we see that happening as we go around. And I would just uh, connect back to something you said a moment ago too. We would view deed as a means of bringing the word. That's actually, it sounds
Hmm.
simpler than it is maybe, but every deed is an opportunity to grow a relationship so that you can bring the word, you can help that individual view themselves biblically. Okay, so individual, what are you? You're made in God's image, you're precious. You are unique in so many ways. God's given you certain gifts. We'd like to help you develop those. But God has also spoken to us through his word. We'd like to help you read his word prayerfully, disciple you, so that you properly understand that, yeah, being precious, being made in God's image with an immortal soul has all kinds of implications. And from there, obviously, we're focusing on the relationship with the self, the proper view of the self, based on the relationship with God. But then also that spills over then to how you view your neighbor, not as a competitor, not as someone to take advantage of, but someone to love and care for. And the creation, which is a blessing from God and also needs to be treated in a stewardly fashion. So yeah, so just handing money out, that may be yeah, there's right ways and wrong ways of helping people. Sometimes it's money, but often it's um, helping them deal with their wrong view of themselves and of their poverty. So a lot of our projects, we learned the hard way that if you just walk in and start providing money for seed, let's say an agricultural project, all that kind of thing, you just walk in and say, you assume everyone thinks the same way we do with our blessing of hundreds of years of Christian worldview thinking. That money often gets misused, doesn't get used the way it should be. The techniques used in agriculture we find are typically very poor often, and they're done from a perspective that work is a pain, and so it's just do things somewhat haphazardly. Not always true. I don't want to stereotype, but often it's done haphazardly. And then often, if there is a reward, if there is a harvest with help, it's misused. So the men take the money. We've had that issue. Take the money and go out and drink and adopt a lifestyle. Leave their wives. We've had a few cases of that. With some of our agricultural projects. I have especially one in mind right now. So um, we found that we have to start. It's not even tacked onto the side and supplementary. It's actually foundational. We have to start with God's word. You do with the immediate needs, but you have to start very early on with teaching, reading God's word, praying with them, helping them think biblically. Again, something we take for granted, being raised in, I'm sure most of your listeners being raised in Christian families, etc. We take all that for granted. They don't have that. They're shaped by animism, the idea that the crops have a spirit, the stream has a spirit, the tree has a spirit, and they have to placate those spirits. And when something goes wrong, there's a demon somewhere, and they have to go meet the witch doctor and get all kinds of things figured out, and find out, well, what you did is you actually went out in your field and started working when the moon was visible. And when the moon's visible, you're bringing a curse on your village. So now you get blamed by your village for a poor harvest. Okay, so that's just one example.
Oh no.
You're the one who did it. You went out when there was a moon, didn't notice the moon, went out and obviously some points when it's still light out, the moon is shining. But if that's your thinking, that you offend the gods, as it were, the spirits, when you do that, now you get blamed for the harvest. So now you're in trouble. So we see this all over the world. There are very superstitious views. Animism seems to be everywhere. It's almost like a common sin. And I would say, Satan has only so many tricks in his bag, so you see them repeat in different places with wrong views. And animism and fatalism, which is related, we see everywhere. And fatalism says, I can't really make a change. There's nothing I can do that will really change. So why bother? I'm going to keep doing things the same way that my forefathers did. Um, but then, yeah, that sort of they're enchained to that animistic way of thinking, which often shapes the way they do their crops, when they do their crop, when they plant their seed, all that kind of thing. So that all has to be dealt with up front. Otherwise, simply your project will not be successful. Yeah.
Interesting. Hmm. So there's no, I guess that fatalism, there's not often a vision for, hey, if I had a bunch of money, like here's how I would climb out of this situation.
Tyler, there's a great book called Culture Mapping that I've used in a number of settings. Also, when asked to provide advice to various organizations, seminaries starting to get involved in the developing world, just to help them see the great distance between our thinking in the West and the thinking of the rest, as it were.
Hmm.
And the idea of assessing yourself and of making change and setting goals, that's a Western thing.
Hmm.
It's a Western, yeah. People are just used to doing the same thing because my dad did it that way, my grandpa, and it goes back many generations. We plant at this time of the year. So to get them to actually plant at a different time because the rain patterns have changed is a big mountain to climb.
Really?
We've always done it this way at this time of year. So now you start to look for the change leaders. Okay. You,
Hmm.
you say, okay, who's willing? And that's why, sometimes we can't just work with the whole community. We got to pick out the individuals who are willing. They're the ones, and sometimes you would say, well, God has helped us select those. Lord, we pray, where are those leaders that we can work with? And
Hmm.
and most communities, above a certain number are going to have some people who are willing to try new things. They do it carefully. There's always some risk for them of being different, but they're the ones that then need to, you work with them, you pray with them. When I say we, it's our partners. Okay, so just to step back, Word and Deed works with 27 partners around the world. We walk beside them. They're Christian indigenous believers. We really emphasize working with indigenous churches and believers. They they take ownership of the project. They know their culture, they know their language. um, they walk beside them. And I'm saying that's not the only way, but we take that way, and we're pretty bullish on it. We do see the Lord blessing it, but yeah, they're gonna understand, and ultimately we do need the Lord's blessing, right? So that's why prayer is so fundamental. Lord, help us find the right people along with our partners. That's the prayer they have. Find the right people. Help us to bring God's word to them so their thinking starts to change. They become a model for change in their community. The community sees success. So agriculture is just one example.
Hmm.
Starts to see success. Pray that there isn't jealousy. We've had issues or we've heard stories where a woman faithfully adopts all these things and has a good crop, but there's jealousy now, so the crop gets burned by the community. That's one thing. Or because they think something spiritual has happened where she's reached out to foreign gods as far as they're concerned that have helped her but haven't helped them.
Right.
So they're incurring the wrath of their gods. She's bringing in, all that. You see some
Oh
of that
man.
thinking that it's also echoes of the Old Testament, quite literally, right?
Yeah.
Echoes of the Old Testament. I've seen it all over. It's like, wow, I feel like I'm right back there in that
Wow.
time. And then, okay, now you're back to square one. Now that lady's afraid, that particular person, it's not just one or two, could be a small group, is afraid to proceed with all that she's learned, and she falls back to her old patterns.
Wow.
So those are some of
That's
the challenges. So again, this is God's work. It needs God's blessing. We need to, we walk with our partners. We have prayer. Our team has prayer every day together, and those who are available every morning. And we're praying for these partners because they're up against, just like we are, they're up against, not only the people, but the forces behind them, as the Bible talks about, right? That
hmm.
Satan doesn't want to change, to help these people change. That they're not they're serving other gods. Whatever mechanisms can be used that can stop them from moving in the right direction, he's
Wow.
going to
Yeah.
use. But we serve a greater God, right? And
Mhm.
we see the Lord breaking through. We see churches growing in the midst of persecution. We see faithful implementation of teaching. It all takes time, though. That's key. But yeah, as my colleague said the other day, it could take us 10 years to do something, but God could answer us prayer and change it all in 5 minutes. He could. Sometimes he does.
Yeah.
Sometimes things just, bam, suddenly the whole thing changes around. But our key is, and it's almost like, God will call someone, some key leader. He called Abraham, he called Saul, who became Paul, he called Luther. Sometimes he calls a key person in a community or two, and they become the leaders. We're working with a pastor in Uganda who's very bravely bringing the gospel to Muslims, and we've helped him with Bibles and all kinds of things. So now there's a lot of Muslims starting to convert. The problem is often it's the women, and they get the men often, who are still Muslims, react very negatively. It's at the risk of their lives that they begin to confess Christ. So many of them have to flee. So we're funding programs through this pastor and his team and his church to hide them and
Oh,
to
wow.
run vocational programs so these women can start to run little businesses and provide for their families. So quick little
Wow.
story. There's an imam, a powerful imam in a place in Uganda, and one of his daughters, is attending a program related to this pastor. It's a school, it's a Bible study with a bunch of friends, and she's by God's grace converted. And the imam is beats her. He's very angry. He's embarrassed in this community. So this young lady flees, and she's in hiding, and she's attending this Christian school. I'm not sure if it was a Christian school. It might have just been just a school that had a bit of a Christian background. But what happened, and we heard about it on the news here, what happened is a group of Muslim, gangsters, you could say, radicals, came over from the Congo and attacked that school and the community and killed a whole bunch of people, and she was one of them.
Wow.
So the imam now is he's a dad. He's very sad. So he approaches his community, Muslim community. Need to have a funeral. Well, no, she's a Christian, no funeral. So, but the Christian pastor I've been talking about, he says to him, "Come over here and we'll do a funeral." So the imam attends the funeral. And he's blown away by the service, by the love, by the gospel that's shared as a part of it, and the Lord starts working in his heart. So he becomes a Christian.
Wow.
So you see, the Lord uses a tragedy to save this man. And he starts working on fellow imams. And we can say there's been, I don't know what number, I don't want to give a number, but it's certainly in the 30, 40 range of people that the Lord has used him to, leaders, often, to bring into God's kingdom. Isn't that neat? But
That's
he knows, he
amazing.
says to that pastor, and a pastor tells us, he doesn't expect to live much longer. He's been threatened. You're probably aware, to convert from Islam to Christianity is to take your life in your hands. But he takes his life in his hands, but he says, I've dedicated my life to God. And as long as the Lord's, pleased to use me as a means to bringing other Muslims into his kingdom, it's all good. So that started with a little girl, not a little girl, a teenager, you know, attending a Bible study with some friends.
Wow.
So that's how the Lord's working.
That's amazing. That's and so Word and Deed's place there is to provide just like resources to help this pastor
Yeah, that
with
pastor reached
Bibles
out
and
to us through
things.
another board member, actually, at one time, a pastor who does a lot of work in Africa. And we help him with that. He does regular journeys to Africa to teach and to train, but he builds connections and he says, oh, here I see this man working faithfully, and he connects us with them. And he's a means of ensuring that initial relationship. And then afterwards, we start to do regular visits. So we do annual visits. We have regular calls with that pastor. Yeah, every project we do, of which there's 55 ongoing, and at any time maybe 70 one-time projects, from small to large, big construction projects to a bunch of books. All of those have project agreements, they have goals, they have reporting requirements, all that kind of thing. So we're very careful. We know that people are giving sacrificially, and we treat those donations very carefully. And so we have regular calls, annual visits typically. We have project agreements that are carefully written as noted. And then twice a year, sometimes 4 times a year if it's very early on, but it settles down into a pattern. And twice a year, we get a written report, we get a financial report. We'll do light audits, sometimes a little more detailed audits to ensure that everything lines up. And that's our system that we put in place. So I just had a 2-hour call yesterday with one partner in India, another 2 hours tomorrow. I was on with Egypt for 2 hours on Tuesday, with partners, just reviewing reports. Where are they at? So what we try to do is we walk beside, we we help them with strategic planning, with problem assessment. Obviously, we ensure everything's in good order, as already noted. But the other thing too is we learn a lot of lessons. So with started in the 90s. I joined in 2005, but we inherit a lot of that. But lots of experience, but we then carefully share that experience with our partners. Let's not fall in the same potholes. Let's avoid the potholes. Let's try
Mm.
to set things up properly. So as we learn, we're sharing that, and we're helping with leadership development and capacity assessment. Just because, for example, a partner wants to respond to a disaster nearby, they can come with this big, huge proposal. But the question becomes, do they have the capacity? So we ask a whole bunch of questions to ensure they're not overwhelmed.
Right.
So
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess to take a step back, so you described a very personal, like personalized project mentality of auditing exactly what's happening in this certain situation, even knowing who these partners are. Like it's a very obviously a very intense version of aid. Like you know who these people are. Um,
yeah,
like just to take a step back out of the work of word and deed specifically, how does that contrast to like what the Western government's been doing? Um, and this idea, I guess, of like, so there's kind of relief and there's aid or development, I guess. So like relief being something like a tragedy happens, an
yeah,
earthquake, some natural disaster of some kind, or even political turmoil or something where a Western government will say, now these people need money, they need aid, they need food, they need whatever. Um, how is that different than the development side? And then where is the government here? Where does our government in the Western world, I guess, in the States and Canada, where do they typically step in and are either of those effective from their like broader, not very personalized approach? Like send the
yeah.
Red
So picture
Cross in.
picture a road, picture a road, Tyler. Someone walking along. Suddenly there's just a disaster. So you picture a line going down. So there's a relief phase. We call that the relief phase. At that point, parable Good Samaritan, guy's flat on his back, can't do much to help himself. Good Samaritan just need to help him. He can't do much for himself. You keep that phase. That's phase one, relief phase. You're providing food, water, shelter. That's what we're doing right now in Myanmar. So remind me to get back to that. We're just providing what they need, but now as soon as possible, we go into a rebuilding phase, recover back to where you were. Okay, so now you want those being helped to start to do a fair bit themselves. So, rebuilding could be rebuilding their homes. We'll help you provide with the pieces you're missing. We have to do what's called a gap analysis. What can you do yourself? That's important. It's a biblical principle. Do what you can do yourself, and we'll help you with the gap if we're convinced of the overall need. Okay, so in that case, hurricane hits Nicaragua, 2007, I think it was, six maybe. Miami International Seminary, you may have heard of that ministry from the URC, was already working there. They call us in to help. Um, we, we we quickly provide some funding so that the team on the ground that's been trained by Mintz, which is a real blessing, by the way. They're already thinking from a reform perspective. Um, they're actually helping bring food to a lot of communities that have just been knocked flat, like homes gone, a lot of death, etc., a lot of injury. So food, building supplies, let's cleanse the wells. That's a problem. A lot of ocean water came in. So
Right.
the equipment to do that, pumps, etc., chainsaws, go in, cut the trees down. These pastors work really hard. I joke that I can't picture our anyway. They're in there with chainsaws and they're cutting the trees into planks, and we provide the wood. But now because you're able, you rebuild your house. Very simple houses. You're able to do that. We aren't going to do that for you.
Right.
We'll provide what you're missing. It's the Ruth, I call it the Ruth principle. Okay, so the story of Ruth, and we'll get back to government in a minute. But the story of Ruth, which the Israelites were commanded, I think in Deuteronomy or Leviticus, leave the corners of the field, don't harvest those, and leave what falls behind, even the reapers. So now, what does Boaz do? Very loving, but he ensures that Ruth is safe, right? And she's able to go in. He doesn't hand her flour. Okay, that's the government related comment.
Right.
He doesn't hand her the flour. He says, "You go in, and I'll make sure the guys don't bother you." and you're in there harvesting the corners. That's what she did. She worked hard. She harvested the corners of the field. She did the threshing. She comes home ultimately with flour for her mother so they can eat. So the principle there is, and it's a respectful principle that says we help people. We do the asset analysis. What do you have? What can you do yourself? We'll help you with the gap if we're convinced of the overall need. And now you need to do what you do. Otherwise, we're not going to help you. Tough love, right? Tough love. We're
Mm.
not going to help. We're going to help for a while, but we're going to back off at a certain point. No, you can do it yourself. And that's I just love that picture of Ruth. And that's what governments fail to see. They just come in and they just give handouts, and over time, initially people had to go in and collect the money, but that became too embarrassing. And even they were challenged initially to find jobs, all that kind of thing. Now it's very impersonal. They get checks in the mail, and sadly, that isn't really treating people with dignity. It
Mm.
causes them to become dependent, and this is a human problem. It doesn't matter where you're living in the world. If you're going to receive handouts, there's a real temptation just to rely on those handouts. And then, without even understanding, let's say, your relationship with yourself and with God, as we touched on earlier, you begin to feel, depressed, unhappy. You wrestle with addictions. You're not being treated with respect. You're not treating yourself with respect. Um, you start to look for happiness in the wrong places. You've got a
Mm.
you've got a God-shaped hole in your heart that only God can fill. So that's why we need to start with the gospel. So our Western governments have forgotten a Christian worldview, have responded to problems in society in the wrong way, and we end up now with this massive, massive underclass that is dependent on the government, and an increasing number of homeless people and addicted people. And
Mm.
that's that's because the approach to poverty alleviation has a lot of problems.
Yeah, it's such a challenge because I guess you see that it's hard to say to someone, I'm lowering your dignity by helping you. Um, it's
It doesn't mean you don't do so initially, Tyler. So
right
there's some
for
help initially,
in the
but
relief,
you could say, I'm
right?
going to help you. But then there's a bit of a conversation that says, again, if you're flat in your back, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, you just need to help. But as quick as possible, you assess what they can do themselves, and you say, you know what, I'm going to help you with this, but now you need to do that because
Yeah.
you're able. And I want to treat you with dignity. And dignity means that I want to give you that opportunity and even obligation to use your own talents, your own capabilities that God has given you to provide for your own needs, because that's God's design. If you don't work, you don't eat, he says in Thessalonians, right?
Mm.
So there's a tough love piece to it at a certain point. And from there on, you're responsible. I mean, lots of examples of that. Marvin Olasky in the book Tragedy of American Compassion talks about the 19th century churches in New York, and they had a whole approach to how to deal with the poor. They did assessments of the poor. They even said, like, if you're able-bodied, you had to cut some wood first before you got a meal. Like you came in for a meal, you just didn't get a meal. You had to do something. So you cut
Wow.
some wood, you did this, you cleaned up, you did, if you're not able, so that's the initial assessment. If you're totally incapable, yeah, you're not able-bodied, you just need help. Okay, that's one approach. But if you're able-bodied and you're hard, you're down on, on, you've got lots of challenges in life, but you can swing an axe, you're going to cut some kindling, and then we'll give you some food. But now we're going to assess you and say, you know, so that's that relief phase, okay? We're just,
Mm.
and even in that relief phase, you're doing a little bit yourself. But now we're looking at, okay, where's your family? What's the biblical approach to this? Where's your family? Why aren't they helping you? So we'll help you reconnect with your family, okay? So they got off on the wrong track, we'll help you reconnect. And the family's challenged, especially if they're Christian, to provide for the needs of this person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if there's no family, now and you're able-bodied, we're gonna help you find a job. And in the meantime, we're going to help you a little bit in terms of getting through, but we're going to challenge the families in our churches to give you a job and beyond. And inevitably, a job was found. So now we're not going to help you anymore. You need to now go do your work. So, yeah, sadly, some of the churches, there was a bit of a blowback there, and increasingly there was a sense, hey, no, we need to just focus on the gospel and not on the deed,
Mm.
which, yeah, you could overemphasize the deed, but Christ himself was compassionate. When he says, I think, was it John's apostles, right, who come and say, or John's disciples, So who are you? And he quotes Isaiah, I came to heal the lame, right? To heal the blind, to feed the hungry. That was a critical part of his ministry. Um, we're composite beings. We have bodies and souls. We cannot separate the two. So any ministry needs to answer that question. How are you treating people as composite beings? And especially this one. So we can't only treat the physical. We can't only treat the spiritual, even though there can be emphasis depending on the ministry. We need to keep both in mind, especially when it's poverty alleviation.
Yeah, man, there's so much in there. I wonder, is there something broken with our Western mindset then? Like that we can't conceptualize. It's hard to separate our way we view the world or even our work, or I mean, it's probably even maybe more difficult as Christians, although I guess we're aware maybe. Um, it's like if you're working in your church or even your mission committee, there's minutes and you're doing all this work and there's schedules and we're gonna do meetings every month, and there's so much structure and forethought that goes into even the thinking about how to do the work, let alone doing the actual work. So like I think when we give to somebody, we say, well, they're just going to view it like I view it. They're going to say, oh, I have excess money now. Now, good. I can, you know, achieve my plan of rising out of this state that I'm in. And it's so hard to say to somebody like it feels weird to say you're creating a dependency. It feels like a wild animal in your backyard. You start feeding it and it just comes back. And one
Yeah.
day it doesn't know how to go forage for itself. It feels like it's like
But
a,
that, but see, but that's our challenge too in the ministry we're in. We have to be very careful as we work with partners. And there's a great need. A lot of our partners are working with the poorest of the poor. They're poor beyond your imagination. They're just right. So we start with effectively a relief phase. But if we're not careful, we don't turn the corner into rehabilitation or rebuilding. I didn't actually complete that picture. So, we get them to start helping themselves, get them back. So if there is a disaster, you get back to where they were. But now if you developed a team in the meantime that's really shown some potential,
mm,
and getting back to level ground is still a really bad scenario. Now you work with that team to help them develop. Okay, so you asked about development earlier,
mm,
and we didn't finish that picture. So now we get into a development phase. Let's help them get beyond where they were, which was subsistence, bare survival kind of thing. But always we have to employ the principles and not forget and not get caught in a scenario where we're kind of halfway there. We're part
mm,
way there, and now we're developing dependency, and then there's a problem with you know decreasing dignity and in a sense of self-worth, in the positive perspective of that term. Um, and then there's growing, growing challenges with addiction, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all connected, and we
right.
have to we have to we learn as we go too, and we're say, oh, we took our eye off there and we didn't really help our partner realize, hey, there's some dependency being created, and then before you know it, there's expectation
Hmm.
and there's demand. No, you can't do that. You can't take it away. Don't take it away, right? Now you're the bad guy, and that's
Right.
hard on partners. That's hard to do. So before you know it, they're happy, they're thankful. Then there's expectation, and then there's dependency. It's an addiction of sorts,
Hmm.
arguably. That says now
Yeah,
you take it away, and
yeah.
you got angry people.
There is no way of getting rid of it. Yeah. I know
Yeah,
you start feeding a cat and it comes by and now it's sitting on your porch for
yeah,
3 weeks. It's like,
it's right.
but it feels like, is it like an arrogance of like the way we view things in the West, or is it just like we're taking for granted how, like even how we think, like how we value, like I would say even secular culture acts as if they're made in the image of God, even though if they don't know it or say it, like,
We do have superiority complexes, so that when Helping Hurts gets into that, there's a lot of things that happen when, and I alluded to that earlier, where I was the bad guy. I made a lot of mistakes early on, where I would come in and just listen to people, or not even listen. I would come in, assess the situation. Let's say I remember a trip to Colombia early on, and I would look around and say, yeah, you don't even need to talk. I didn't say that, but that's effectively what I said. I'll just tell you what you need to do. And that's small g God complex. Okay, so that's what we have in the West. We have a God complex, and it's not only, as you say, you're right, not only in the Christian area but in the secular area. We're successful, so it's the rich. Okay, we're successful. We got the answers. It's the rich coming in and helping the poor, and it reinforces, if you're not careful, both of those issues. So it's the shame thing on the one side, it's the God complex pride on the other. A lot of those interactions actually reinforce each other
Mhm.
by default if you're not
So
careful.
like the Westerner says, "Oh, they actually did need me all along. Like
Yeah, you need
they
me
are
even
lazy. They really
right
do
up
need my
front,
money."
but even right up front to say, you know what, you're doing this wrong, you're doing that wrong. You have to do it this way. That's the way it works. There's different ways of coming alongside that can be very demeaning, right? Yes,
And they
there are
and
some things that they need to learn from us, but we also need to learn from them. There's a lot we
mm,
can learn from them. They're much more relationship based than we are. We're goal oriented. They're relationship based.
oh,
So
interesting.
we need to go in like Paul says too. I'm looking forward. I think it was Rome, right? Looking forward to visit you because I want to learn from you. So these are things we have to remind ourselves, and that's why, when I talked about a biblical view of poverty and mentioned all those biblical concepts, they include humility. They include respect, stewardship, the idea that they're image bearers. We're image bearers. They're image bearers. Don't mistreat them. Like there's a secular author I have here somewhere, and Mbizo Moyo, who captures some of that because she says to the West, she's from Zambia, I believe, economist, stop treating us like children.
Mm,
Because when you do, we act like children and we remain children. Challenge us.
right. So it's like it's reinforcing that.
Yeah.
So the Westerners are having their God complex kind of
Yes.
reinforced, but then the in the developing world, they're also like, oh, I knew I couldn't do it. This
Right.
is,
Fatalism, right? We
oh,
talked about that.
I knew
Yeah.
we just needed their help, and like I'm never gonna get out of here, and we've been like this for generations. So, yeah, I guess it's just such a struggle unless you really get on the ground and do what Word and Deed is doing. I guess is like,
Yeah. Really, really through our partners. And we walk beside and say, here's the things we learned. Here's what and it's not like when prospective partners come to us, we get a lot of emails, a lot of requests, but we're pretty careful because we want them to be a Christian, pointed in the right direction. By and large, they're reformed to begin with. Sometimes we're able to encourage them in that direction, the doctrines of grace, etc. I got to, by the way, introduce the Heidelberg Catechism to 450 pastors in an Asian country a few months ago.
mm,
It's fantastic.
wow,
So
that's cool.
translated into their language and presented as a tool for them
Wow.
to use. They loved it. So anyway, yeah, we need, through our partners, help them develop, help them understand how to come alongside, to be loving, but also to be challenging in the right way that honors God and honors them as an image bearer who has been created in God's image, and is to live a life of dignity. Ultimately, with the goal of helping them develop faithful families where husbands understand that they're called to provide and protect. That's default for us, but this is news to a lot of people, like we talked about in Colombia. This is what you're called to do. And that's what the Christian school. So what's our answer to that? Well, in Colombia, we support a number of Christian schools. And the teaching there is to young men, to boys, you're called to love your wife, biblical view. Love your wife, love your children, protect your family, provide for your family, and be a servant leader. So let's test that. So I interviewed a young man in grade 11 a number of years ago, and I want to hear that. So I asked the questions, and I said, I started by saying, well, tell me a little bit about your life. And he says, well, I don't know my dad, and I'm on my second, third sort of, half father. They keep leaving. So I said, well, what did you learn from that? Like, what are you going to be like? It's grade 11. He graduates. They graduated grade 11 in Columbia. He says, well, I've learned in this school that I need to be a biblical and a godly father and husband. I need to protect my family. I need to be a servant, all those things. And
Mm,
that was so good to hear. There's no prompting for me. That was a test, right? And I
yeah.
just picked one guy and we had a little interview and he says, I'm committed to that. I says, is it going to be tough? He says, it's going to be really tough because my peer group will mock me.
Hmm.
There's social pressure not to be a committed father and husband, sadly. So you're fighting upstream, you're swimming upstream. And that's true in almost all of these situations I've been describing, all these cultures. They're, it's wrong thinking. Their poverty is often based on wrong thinking, animism,
Mm.
fatalism, selfishness, um, wrong view of the man, wrong view of the woman, etc., wrong view of children. And it's swimming upstream to change.
Yeah. Yeah. There's two things I wanted to go down there. One would be their developing world's culture, the governments, and then let's get into persecution maybe, and then we'll come back to this because you mentioned all these issues with the culture, but I just am am hearing echoes in my head of what's coming down the pipe
Yeah.
in our developed culture,
Yes.
in the Western world, I guess. So let's start with the governments, I guess, of these third world countries or these developing countries. Like, is it just a cultural thing that they're getting this social pressure? Is it just a social thing, or is the government, I mean, persecution's an easy one, I guess, and maybe you can give some examples of that because that's probably a thing you run up against every day. But also, are the governments feeding into that social pressure to keep their people in a certain place, intentionally or unintentionally?
So let's return to persecution in a minute. So governments tend to be corrupt. I would say they tend to be corrupt everywhere, but we have checks and balances in the West that when they function, and they don't always do that, when they function, they keep us, we're all sinful and forget who said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right?
Mm,
That's predictable. We've had some genuinely good dictators in history, but they're far and few between. Most of them
hmm
are maniacs. So when there's checks and balances, very, very well put together, you would say, in the American Constitution, and in Britain as well, in terms of development democracy and the Westminster system, there's checks and balances. What is it at its heart? It's a recognition that man's sinful.
hmm
It's a Christian answer to government. So where that's imitated properly, there are checks and balances. Sadly, even when it's imitated in a lot of countries of the world, it doesn't really work. And the judges
Right.
are under control, let's say, of the guy
Mm,
in power. Everyone's voting whatever the guy in power says.
right.
And you end up with an elite, and this is true almost without exception in the developing world. You end up with 10, 20% of the population exploiting the rest of the population. They're getting rich. The rest is being exploited. There might be a little bit of a middle class, but often there's a pretty high percentage down at the bottom that's having a very tough life. Corruption. Corruption is a huge problem. An interesting question. Paul Collier has a book called The Bottom Billion. These are impoverished people. Interesting question that he asks is, look at it. When you look at a government, ask where they're getting their money from.
Mm,
So if their money's coming from bilateral aid from the West, it's in their interest to present their countries as being as poor as possible and ensuring that anything that's done to help it in the end doesn't become successful.
mm.
See
Oh,
that?
that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
They don't
that
just
kind of
print
turned
it,
my
eh?
head
That's
around
what
when I read
that's what
that.
we do.
Yeah,
We just print it, sell more bonds.
yeah, that's right. So that is sadly, there could be, bilateral aid is often a big challenge because follow the money. So a lot of times they end up with huge bank accounts in Switzerland and different parts of the world, and one after the other, they exploit their opportunities in power, and it's almost expected, at least
Mm,
by that elite group of people. And again, it's a lot of the Latin American countries too. There's about 20 families, roughly 20
wow.
to 30 families that control that country. They own the big businesses, they run the government, and if you're not in their group and you start to become successful as a business person, don't get too big because they'll slap you down.
I say, how hard is that then for these people to rise out of it? Because
Oh,
I mean, even in some of my reading on this before this episode, I was reading on like these small businesses are fairly easy to start with thing called microfinancing. Like people
yeah,
are
yeah, we do that some
but then
places. Yeah,
once you become a little bigger, it's very difficult to break through to become
yeah,
anything that we in the Western world would call like a significant, like big business or even a small business. Small business out here is like 500 employees, but
yeah.
um,
I mean, in developed world, so we have in Haiti, that's a wow, what a challenged country, broken. gangs controlling Port-au-Prince. For the most part, we have a Christian school there that we support, our Adoration Christian School, with about 500, 600 kids.
Wow. That's good.
Um, they continue to run. They're indigenous led. They shut down periodically. It's amazing. Um, but we also have another organized partner there that do microloans amazingly in Haiti, and they do it well. But they train their people to think biblically, and they do small loans, they start small businesses, they develop savings accounts. It's amazingly successful, but they don't necessarily encourage them to get too big.
Right.
And we see that in other places too. You can do reasonably well, live reasonably well, but if you become too big, you stick your head up above the parapet, as it were, you're gonna get shot off. So
Wow.
that's
Yeah.
that's the challenge.
So the
Yeah.
goal is like, I feel like when I think about poverty, like if someone says, what's poverty? And you're thinking about how to get I mean, Bono did this way back when, like from U2. He was like, let's just get rid of poverty in the whole world. It was like, okay, like good
Yeah.
luck. But that was like, let's take entire countries out of this system. But it seems like there's no real way to do that because you're fighting against the government and corruption. That's just this layer of like, we need to keep this country looking not great so we can keep our money flowing in.
Yeah. So aid through governments, sometimes necessary, especially when there's disasters, generally not a great idea. So you want to come alongside in different ways, come alongside bottom up instead of top down. Okay, we would say top down doesn't work well. There are some
Right. Okay.
exceptions,
Yeah.
but by and large, top down doesn't work. Bottom up, especially through the churches, we would say that's God's design. Christian thinking doesn't mean churches start businesses necessarily. Be careful with that a little bit. But they can facilitate, they can help, in the training, etc. But help people think biblically. That's the key answer.
Right.
Obviously
Mhm.
God's grace is needed, so we pray for that. That the gospel is is effective, right? The calling of the Holy Spirit, transforms hearts. But to think biblically, and then everything starts to fall into place once that happens. Work, stewardship, family, roles of husbands and wives, children obeying their parents, all those things. Loving your neighbor. You know, there's an Asian country we do a fair bit of work in, and I remember a story that said, well, I asked, well, how do the Christians compare in these villages, with the major religion all around them, the competing religion, you could say,
Hmm.
how would you compare the families? We said, they're peaceful. They're not fighting with each other. They're concerned about their neighbors. You got to picture this. These are people that live beside each other for millennia, and really they've degraded into a lot of fighting, squabbling. Suddenly these people care about their neighbor, and their families start to reflect the proper family structure. And that almost becomes a threat to the leaders, by the way.
I was gonna say that seems like you're
Yeah,
sticking your head out
they
above the
they actually
crowd too.
they actually yeah. There's a measure of that. They start to learn to read because they want to read God's word, and
Mm-hmm.
they start to challenge their leaders. And yeah, that can lead to persecution. So you touched on that earlier. So
Yeah.
we do see persecution rising in a lot of countries. Open Doors talks about that. We're in the top 30. We're in maybe 5 or 6 of the top 30 countries.
Oh,
Nigeria being one of them, for example. There was just an attack the other day that came close to impacting one of the schools we support there. Um, but yeah, persecution is rising. And so we would say wherever the Lord is active, there is persecution. Also in our own society, maybe in different ways, but where Christians really speak out, there is pushback, increasingly so. Um, I'd like to tell you a little story
mm-hmm.
about that. So she would say, okay, if we take a step back and sort of summarize some of the principles we've talked about, we need a biblical view to solving poverty. We need Christians to take the lead in their communities, even when there's pushback. So here's an example. Drought is still a big problem in major parts of Africa and Asia. So in this one area where our partner has a number of churches, actually quite an area, their child mortality rate is about 1 to 2 out of 5 children don't make it to 5 years of age.
Wow.
That's shocking. So we've been helping them put in wells all over the place as much as we can. Often there's even pushback. They don't want Christians putting in wells because then they get a good reputation. So there's
Wow.
pushback.
That bad?
So let me give you an example of that. So there's the one area where there's a small church in the midst of a a pretty, a strong presence of the other major religion. And they often have these big festivals, and there's tens of thousands of people that come. And there's a little Christian church just in the middle of this. And so they wanted to take, we put in 32 wells a few years ago in a lot of these areas, or at least funded it. So we come in, our guy, our drill rig guy comes in. He doesn't have the highest end of equipment. He can go down 200 feet. The other folks, they bring in someone before that can go in, I think, 300 feet down. They couldn't find water. Lots of cost, no water, no new well. So our guy comes in, he does an initial drill, and nothing happens. So we're thinking, yeah, we don't want to, that costs a number of thousands of dollars to do that. I forget the exact number. It's not, no water, but he still needs to be paid. So there's several $1,000s sort of down the drain, no pun intended. So, but the people there, they say, well, you know what? We'd like to do one more try. Well, convince us. We say, well, we're praying and we're convinced God is going to give us a well. So, okay, God can answer that prayer. And in the end, we say, well, there's a lot of challenges there. We're going to support this. So we're going to pray too. So they start to drill. Okay. And they get surrounded by the other, the folks from let's say the competing religion. I'm being careful with my words here, also due to persecution. And in fact, our projects have been attacked because of something we had on our website a few years back. So we are careful. So they start to drill that well, and it gets surrounded by these people, and the people start heckling and they're challenging. And they're saying, well, we drilled the well 300 feet. You're only going down 200. You already tried once. Like, who are you fooling? Well, the answer the Christians give is, well, we prayed about it, and we think God's going to answer that prayer. And if he doesn't, that's right. It's the Daniel's three friends answer. If he doesn't, that's God, right? He's in
Doesn't
control.
prove anything to you.
Yeah.
Yep.
We're confident in God. So picture this. It's going down 100 feet, nothing. 150 feet. Okay, it's 200 is the max. Nothing. 170, nothing. 180, nothing. 185, water gushing out 15 feet away from the max of this drill. Water going everywhere. And there's a big crowd by this time from the competing religion. They're shocked, completely shocked. And so someone starts to say, wow, you've got a special God. Tell us about your God. Like, how is this possible?
It's
What
like
is
a
this? Who is this
Mount
God that
Carmel
you're
moment.
serving? Isn't that something? I've got more stories like that. Um, we serve the King of the Kings and the Lord of Lords. He's in control. Sometimes we forget that. I think in the West we have all these technical answers to everything, but he is in control. He loves to answer prayer, and he loves to show shocking things. That's shocking. Like you're 10, 15 feet away from the end, and then bang. And we pray and we don't know, but the Lord's in control again. That a number of people who witnessed this kept asking questions, and we're blessed. I haven't really circled around to find out for sure, but yeah, that's God. That's our God.
Wow.
He's at
Yeah,
work.
that's amazing.
So
And
yeah,
yeah, and you're sitting over here going, "Ah, you just did a drill."
yeah. No,
Like,
we wrestled with that. So
wow. That's yeah, that's an amazing story. That's crazy. So, do you see, well, you mentioned you've had some of your initiatives or partners' initiatives attacked. Do you see that persecution a lot in these situations? Are these people hanging around this drill site? Is it hostile?
there's a lot of hostility in various, in especially some countries. Again, I need to be careful with naming them, but I we have agreed as a team to name Nigeria. There is a lot of hostility. Um, Half the country, a little over half, is Muslim, and there's a very aggressive Boko Haram group that looks like ISIS, if you remember
Oh
ISIS,
wow.
and they would say, you know, they're anti-Western, so they would view anything that's Western as being anti-Muslim, as being Christian. So they view schools as being Christian. It's a Christian idea. So when there's a school in a community, they will attack the community for allowing that school to be present, because that's an invasion of Christian thinking.
Wow.
And
That's
also
a
the idea of
Western.
girls going to school, that's even more Christian. And the idea of a Christian school, let alone they don't really make the difference. But if there's there's a pastor going in there and teaching, like, that's now they feel completely justified in attacking And you recall in the news that hundreds of schoolgirls being kidnapped in Nigeria, probably from a few years ago.
Yep.
That's Boko Haram. That's the group doing that. They feel justified in kidnapping girls who are going to school, not being raised in Muslim homes, and they can turn them into sex slaves. That's their view, or they
Wow.
sell them into slavery. So unless they get rescued, but a fair number of those girls have disappeared. Some have returned. Just recently, there's another group there, the Fulani herdsmen, and they're like a gypsy group. They have large herds and they walk around with machine guns and don't get in their way. So they'll come in and they'll eat all the crops in your field and don't get in their way because they'll shoot you. So they'll come through and eat bare whole communities, but thankfully they're not there every year and they don't come. So they just kind of, this is our turn. This is our
Wow.
disaster. We're not going to stand up to these people. But every once in a while, these are fundamentalist Muslims, and not all Muslims are like that, obviously, but these are our real problem are with the fundamentalist Muslims, and so a few years ago and now again they've attacked a community in which there were also Reformed Christians. They've burned down buildings, they attack people, and that just happened in the last week again in an area of Nigeria, about an hour away from where one of our schools are. So it's
Wow.
getting closer. So typically that they're up in the northern half of Nigeria, which is Muslim. The southern half tends to be Christian and not as much presence there, but they
Right.
are there, but not as much. But it's increasing. So
Wow.
Nigeria is now top 10. I think it's number 6 or 7 worst country in the world for persecution. And tens of
Wow.
thousands of Christians have been killed there in the last 10 years.
Is that government sanctioned basically, or they're running the government essentially?
Not officially,
Right. Of course
not
not.
officially. To be fair, not officially. There's a Reformed pastor there. I've told this story in a number of churches, as have some of my colleagues. Um, he was getting ready for church one day, and there's a knock on the door, and there's a couple of guys there. They say they're from the government. This is on a Sunday, and they need to take him in for questioning. He says, "I don't believe you," and they try to argue with him, and he said, "No." So then they pull out their guns and they force him into their car and they take off. Now their nephew has the presence of mind to hop on a motorcycle from some distance away, and he has a cell phone, so he's trailing behind at some distance. So he calls A for the church to get into prayer, and he calls the police, maybe not in that order, but the police become aware of what's going on and they're starting to chase. So the prayer, and I think the nephew even tells this is God's guidance, tells the churches, pray that these guys would be thrown into confusion. So they end up, after a couple hours of driving and police closing in, they end up in a village where one of these guys lives, and he turns them down a wrong road into a cul-de-sac. Imagine. So God threw him into confusion in his own town. Goes into a dead end. They run into the jungle. They get captured, and the pastor gets freed. So
Wow.
that's one example. Now later, sadly, he's sitting in front of his a couple of months later. He's working on his computer just like I am now, and a bullet comes through the window and shatters. In fact, he gets up and he hears a bang. He comes back. His screen is shattered because a bullet's come through the window, aimed for him, but he's just gotten up and left. Bang, right through them. So he knows they're
Wow.
after him. So he's had to go into hiding and even to leave the country for a period of time. So this is a reform path. This is our brothers and sisters and what they're experiencing, and not just in Nigeria, but in many parts of the world.
Wow. Man, that is powerful stuff. That's so different than what we experience that it's you just don't have
Yeah,
categories to put it
it
in.
kind of it kind of qualifies when we complain, right? It just kind of say,
Yeah.
okay, how about some of these stories? A, poverty, B, religious persecution.
Yeah, and we
Um,
also even our prayer, like we pray for our daily bread every day. And
yeah.
the expectation my pantry's just full. Like and no one's shooting through my windows. That's a
How about
it's a
clean water? Like the idea
yeah.
that we can turn a tap and have water that's drinkable I tell people that in these countries, and they just think that's astonishing. The idea that you can turn a tap and have drinking water.
I have my own well on my own property.
Yeah, yeah,
Like th-
yeah.
I give it to a community for, oh yeah, and I got a canal behind my house. I could go get water out of there if I needed to. Like that's just unbelievable.
But the fact that we would use water, even drinking water for toilet water, is just they shake their heads like, wow, you guys are crazy. Like, why would you do that? Drinking water's precious in these countries.
Yeah, that's
A
amazing.
lot of illness is born through water, and they have a lot of, let's say, yeah, bad water.
Wow.
So
Wow. So, okay, so let's get back to, I guess, the Western world. So you mentioned some of these social pressures and stuff that these people feel in developing countries. And I mentioned, like, I think that you're describing what's slowly coming here. Like, how is the Western world changed? And are we on a good track? I mean, obviously we're not being plunged into poverty immediately, but we do see some of these like these not Western ideologies kind of creeping
Well,
in.
non-Christian, right? Non-Christian. Arguably, communism, fascism has all come out of the West, and ideas have consequences. So, if you think about, Nazism, and you think about Soviet Union, George Orwell, Animal Farm, those all help you understand the thinking that caused huge problems. So, if you think of arguably a European country, the Soviet Union, and in the 30s and 40s, they or even earlier, Lenin's already implementing. Stalin follows up, all these community farms, where you give up your private farms, and it doesn't work, but it's an idea. It's an idea that says, let's do it this way, and it's you lose your private property because that's the one of the fundamental ideas of communism. We all need to be equal, etc. And now we're going to implement all these ideas as to how to work together and build these farms without necessarily testing things, and it's a top down. We have production targets, all that kind of thing, and it's a disaster. And there's millions of people that die. So we would say, no, that wasn't biblical, practical thinking. And it's amazing that millions of people had to die because of bad ideas. So in the West, yeah, we've been blessed. Let's say outside of those countries, Western Europe, North America, we've been blessed with a lot of, overall good thinking, somewhat reflective of God's word, and where it has been, we've flourished. So where there has been the, interesting thing I just read the other day. So you are, if you go to church once a week. So let me reword it the way they did. If you could buy something, or if you get some, it's free. If you could get this and take it and do it, and it would almost guarantee you 15 to 20% longer life with no side effects. Would you do it? And this is an article in USA Today from a number of years ago. It just resurfaced. And it turns out it's a Harvard study that says those people who go to church, well, they say a religious, and in America it's mostly church, Christian. You go there every week, at least once a week, and you're somewhat committed and involved, then you will have a longer lifespan of 15 to 20. I think it was 20 to 30% longer
Oh,
life,
wow.
something like that. I had the number slightly off. Anyway, significant improvement. But you and I know it's not just attending; it's actually being shaped by the teaching and understanding what's a Christian family look like, all that kind of thing. There are wonderful benefits. Now, as we see a society turning its back on the practice of Christianity, all kinds of wrong thinking gets introduced, and we fall back to our natural tendency, I think our natural sins, which is men failing to protect and provide for their families. Mom's always often left holding the fort. And we know, Thomas Sowell's a black economist in his 90s now. He's written, I don't know how many books, thousands of articles. And he would say one key to getting out of poverty is dual parent homes. And single parent homes are almost guarantees of poverty. So so what happened? Well, in the 1940s, he says 85% of black families had dual parents, and they were generally doing pretty good. 1940s.
Mm.
Now you get the Johnson years in the 60s. Johnson, I think well-intended, sort of the Great Society, and it's all kinds of programs to help single mothers, especially. So now the single moms, because they're going to get money for nothing, they kick out the men. I can't
Right.
get this money if you're here. Go live somewhere else. And it was
Yep.
pretty generous. So badly designed, maybe well-intended, badly designed. So by the 1970s, you go from 85% to I think 35 or 40% of black
Wow.
families had double parent. So that, and there's all kinds of things that go sideways. You end up with kids without dads, young men without dads to provide the proper training, and these young men who leave and go off and live on their own, they're not experiencing any sense of fulfillment, and they develop lifestyles. So that, and I recognize that's been, I think the programs were especially aimed at the Black population, but same thing would happen with anyone, right? Any color, as white people, everything else. If you get these handouts and
Yeah.
you're motivated to break your family to get the handout, and
Yeah,
you
and it's
do
not
that, there
necessarily
are
like
consequences.
it's not a nefarious thing by the government, but then their solution now, I mean, it's something they're still struggling with in the States, especially, is the answer is more government most of the time.
More money,
It's
more
it's not
government. Yeah,
going back to
right. So
your
they're
Christian
using
roots,
the we're a
basically.
cosmic accident worldview
Yeah.
as opposed to the Christian worldview to assess. And the presentations I do on poverty for a lot of schools and that, I always start with say, well, I'm an engineer, so you got to ask questions. If you don't spend enough time asking questions and assessing the problem accurately, your solution almost without exception will be wrong. So you got to ask questions. And it's by asking
Mm.
questions, especially from a biblical worldview perspective, that you come to the root of the problem. And underlying everything, to keep it simple, is, the problem is sin, the answer is Christ. And if you haven't looked at your problem through that lens, you probably got the diagnosis and the answer, the solution wrong.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's so many different examples of those social ideologies that have crept in even in the last few years. Like, and the answers seem to be even from the conservatives. So I think you mentioned off air, Musk, his answers go to Mars, like, which
Yeah,
is like, I mean, it's
you can't get
escapism
away.
almost, but it's like the answers aren't returned to uh moral Christianity or even the basis of what America was built off of. I mean, which is Christianity, but even if you didn't think it was Christianity, but look at the moral side of it.
So what we have now, Tyler, is a lot of people talking about Christian culture. You may have heard about that. I
Mm.
advocate Christian culture. I don't want to go to church. I don't want to give my allegiance to God, but Christian culture. So it's sort of peripheral. It's sort of external. They'll even show up in church now and then. I'm surprised to hear some people, who are atheists, who are now saying, "Yeah, I go to church now and then," because I appreciate what Christianity's done for our society, and I know we need to recapture some of that. But by the, don't quite say it straight away, but there's not a desire to effectively say no. God is the Lord of my life, and I need Jesus Christ. I need Him to cover my sins so that I can stand before God, holy God, right? Haven't been forgiven. That piece is missing. But the
Yeah.
benefits, how can I have, effectively it's saying I want the benefits without, and I wouldn't even call it the cost, but in a sense it's the cost, but it's really nothing, right? It's
Mm.
come by and eat, right? Don't, no money, no cost. It's free, as I story I told a little earlier. That piece is missing. But hopefully the Lord uses that as a stepping stone and brings them into His kingdom. But at the same time, there's also a lot of well-spoken leaders in society that are speaking of faith and of conversion and the Lord working in their life. So that's wonderful, and that's ultimately the key ingredient.
Mm. Yeah, and that's all we can hope for, really. Like to to bring people into the church to see that they're made in the image of God, because that's really the kingpin of Christianity, but also, like you said before, like if you don't have that worldview of yourself, that relationship with God and the relationship with yourself through that lens, like you just don't make good decisions about everything. So that's yeah. Well, we're getting toward the end here, but I'm interested if you think we've missed anything in this conversation, because there's so many uh, things to weave together here. Um,
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about Word and Deed's approach to this. It's done carefully. We strive to do it humbly. We couldn't do it without God's blessing, but also with the support and donate sacrificial donations of many from these churches I've mentioned. um, you know, the Reformed churches of your listenership. And it's done through various ways. There's business groups. So if you own a business, there's 27 businesses across Canada and US. Love to have you join one of those. There is one in Calgary. There's, in Edmonton, lots of play in BC, Ontario, Michigan, California, Iowa, New York State. There's And that's one way of getting involved. It's a one-to-many. There's also a one-to-one where we do business partnerships with larger businesses that support their own projects. And a major source of funding is church donations, church collections. That's another major source. Individuals giving donations directly is wonderful. And there's fundraisers. So we do have a bike-a-thon coming up on June 7, and it's a coast-to-coast bike-a-thon, which just means there's
Mm.
groups in all different cities, setting up their own little bike-a-thons on that day, maybe doing 10 or 20 kilometers, having a nice time together, and just looking, getting sponsorships and sponsoring, in this case, an HIV/AIDS clinic that we support in South Africa. So just to add a really nice expansion, by the way. So yeah, that would be a way to get involved. There's softball tournaments in a lot of these areas. We do a dinner tour in the fall. So there's all kinds of ways to get involved and hear more. There's our quarterly magazine that comes out in the churches. We're very
Mm.
present online as well in terms of our website, Facebook, Instagram. So there's all kinds of ways to learn, and we covet the prayer of God's people. I hope that's come across as a key theme. We're doing everything not because we can and in our own strength, but ultimately nothing happens, nothing goes well without God's blessing. It's His enabling grace, and love to end with a story. So cue me up when we hit the end point, and
Yeah.
I'll end with that.
No,
So
it's, I mean, I just wanted to say, like, it struck me the power of prayer with some of these stories is just unbelievable. Like, I think we take that for granted. And even knowing, like, reading a newsletter and getting involved to know how to pray for these things is, I think, just something that I'm taking away from this as well. Like, yeah, it's easy to be detached, and you get a quarterly newsletter, and if you love the work and you are involved emotionally, I guess, with it, it's a lot easier to read the stories, understand what's being asked of you, both monetarily but also in prayer, and to be able to pray meaningfully for these things. And like you said, it's like it's something that maybe we take for granted in the West a little more than we should. So
yeah, we do picture
yeah.
ourselves as a bridge, as you see in the About Us webpage, connecting churches. You would say at a very low directly. I know, our team knows the people. We have relationships. They're our friends. They're our brothers and sisters. These are the folks on the front line. So we're a direct connection, and we're regularly in contact. So yeah, a lot of organizations just give money, just send money, and we would say that's one approach, but we would rather ensure that the money is used effectively. Again, doing it carefully, not condescendingly, which can easily happen, but walking side by side our partners. And we see the Lord working, we see the church growing, and we're so thankful for that. So a final story here. There's a denomination in an Asian country. There's three of them actually, that were three separate partners that were walking beside us. They're all rapidly growing, facing lots of pushback. I get regular, every few weeks, I get a notice of another, attack, pastor beaten up, or churches surrounded by all kinds of young men that have been basically hired in a certain sense to cause trouble. Hard for us to imagine, but here's a story. A number of years ago, there was a small church meeting in a small church building, and the pastor's in the middle of leading the service. The door slams from outside, and a man comes stomping up the middle aisle, and he's sort of a leading figure in the community, quite intimidating for this church, which, as we know scripturally, often has, the people from the poorer echelons of society are called first. So this is a bunch of poor, bunch of nondescript, uninfluential people. So this influential guy comes up, and he pushes the pastor out of the way and says to that group, if you worship here next week, we're going to come here with a whole group, and this is young toughs, and we're going to come in and beat you up badly. So they don't want the church growing. Satan doesn't want the church growing. So he goes home. They pray about it, and they lay their needs before the Lord. And that week, that man becomes paralyzed. So what
Wow.
do you think the pastor does?
Goes and prays with the guy.
Yeah, yeah, he goes, knocks on the door.
Wow.
He offers to pray with the guy. They shoo him away. The family get lost, right? So they appeal to the medical, the witch doctors. They appeal to the hospitals. Nothing works. The pastor keeps coming by and says, "We're praying for you." Regular, I don't know about every day, but let's say every few days, once a week. "We're praying for you, and I'd like to come in and pray with you." So eventually they let him in. So I was praying with this guy. And this is weeks later. Nothing's changing. This guy is paralyzed. He starts to pray with him, starts to share God's word with him. Well, in God's time, that man is saved. His family is saved. And he's now sitting in church with his family, worshiping God. So
Wow.
that's the God we serve.
That is
There's
amazing.
and there's more. These are some of the top stories I'm sharing. There's more. There's more like that. Let's go forward in dependence on the Lord. Let's do it with joy. God doesn't give us all this money in the West to live like barons. He doesn't. Let's provide well for our families. Doesn't mean we can't go on vacation, etc. But he calls us to be generous. That's a consistent biblical and imperative. Starting with the Good Samaritan. Let's be generous. Let's support them. Let's do it wisely. Let's do it biblically. And he will, and he does bless the work.
Wow. That's powerful story. I mean, I think people need to hear this too. So I'm very grateful to you for coming on and sharing with us. Like, I think these stories are what we hope for, obviously, when we give money, and it feels very detached at times to just write a check and or put money in a collection bag in church. And deep down, Word and Deed's doing good work. And like, I think from our conversation, I think people can gather like the way that Word and Deed structure. I didn't even bring it up, but if you look at your website, I think it's your about or our methods page,
Yeah.
and you lay out the methods, they work really well with the ideas, concepts from When Helping Hurts, and these ideas of you have to be walking alongside people in their context, and you can't just be throwing money at something. And that deep down of like Word and Deed's doing what is necessary and partnering with the locals and is having impact. But then when you share a story like that, it's like that
Yeah.
makes.
And Tyler, I want to say, that doesn't mean there aren't challenges or, things aren't disappointing here and there. There's stories of builders who were supposed to be building and project manager who was supposed to be visiting, and that didn't happen. And then some of that money goes awry. So yeah, there's disappointing stories too. We live in a broken world, but there's so many, like the Lord is working, the Lord is blessing. And we're humbled as a team. We would say we're humbled. We're kind of the small little intermediary. We have a small role to play. We have the donors giving sacrificially. We have the folks on the front lines working hard, often facing pushback and danger, and we have God blessing the work. So it's a privilege to be part of.
Wow. Well, thank you for all your work. Appreciate what Word and Deed does, and hopefully your work continues to thrive under God's blessing. And appreciate your time coming on and sharing. I definitely learned a lot about poverty, and I have a clearer picture of how, even in our local context, to deal with it. To not just be thinking it's like a throwing money at a problem. So
Yeah.
really
Well,
really
thank
appreciate
you,
it.
Tyler, very much for having us on it. I really enjoyed it, the interaction, and yeah, very, very grateful for what you do, and God's blessing on Real Talk as well.
Okay, much
And may
appreciated.
you have a great impact on your listeners and beyond.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening too. Hopefully you learned something, and you can obviously look up Word Indeed. We'll link them, and also check out their website. Get involved in a local business group, or some of the fundraisers around your local area, because I'm sure there is some. So thank you everybody, and thank you especially to Rick for this conversation. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. In partnership with Reform Perspective, this show is created and produced by Tyler Vanderwood, Lucas Holtfleur, and Mariah Tamiga. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you have any feedback for us or ideas for future guests or topics, please let us know. You can reach us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. Be sure to also follow us on social media. You can search Reformed Real Talk on any of the platforms. We should come right up. Also, leave us a review, preferably a 5-star one, on any of the podcast platforms. That would be greatly appreciated. That's all for now, folks. Keep having real talk.